Hello and welcome to Pressure Point. My name is Valerie Dudoward. Our topic this program, Human Genome Diversity Project. I'd like to welcome my guest, Jeanette Armstrong from the Nalcon Center. Welcome to the program, Jeanette. The topic of our program is one that is very complex to a lot of people, including myself. It is one that is very demanding of learning a fairly large amount of technological kind of information.
Mm-hmm.
I guess to put it in its framework, I just wanted to share a little story with you about my mother's mother, who has passed on in the last 8 years or so. But she told me of a time when she was a young woman who came from a finishing school in Victoria, and she came from a certain lineage, and so she came back by steamboat partway and then by canoe.
Mm-hmm.
And she was sort of carried from that period of time throughout her life to one where she became very used to flying by jet to different
Mm-hmm.
places, mostly in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And so for her, that took a tremendous leap forward. And for us as First Nations people today, and I think human beings in general, there are a lot of things that could be happening to us that we don't even know about, that we have to learn about and protect ourselves about and find information on.
Mm-hmm.
And one of these is the Human Genome Diversity Project. What is this thing?
Okay. I guess probably to begin with, the best way to describe the Human Genome Diversity Project is to describe another larger project, HUGO, which is the Human Genome Project. That project is a worldwide project. It started by scientists and researchers, governments coming together to look at mapping the whole human genome. And it means collecting DNA and finding the DNA code and mapping basically the similarities of people world over. That's the HUGO project. Now in 1994, the Human Genome Diversity Project was adopted by HUGO, the larger project. That project is not concerned with mapping or participating in the HUGO project to map the human genome. It's concerned with finding the divergence from the norm, finding where divergence might be in terms of the DNA or the genetic coding of humans. And one of the areas that the Human Genome Diversity Project is concerned with is in collecting and putting on repository the DNA of Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous peoples who may be endangered from a number of different, for a number of different reasons. One of the reasons could be because they're going to be extinct in a few years, and their DNA will not be available. And so there are a number of reasons like that. Some of the reasons have to do with what kinds of environmental pressures may have created certain kinds of divergence and change. For instance, if they're in a highly toxic area or an area that is very high in radiation levels, there's a number of reasons that the collection and mapping of their DNA could yield some divergence. And so basically that project is a project which was headed by a group of scientists and other people, that a consortium that includes governments, and depending on the outcome of the mapping, what that material will be used for is, I guess, what for myself is what I'm most concerned about in looking at this project in particular. Not only because it is collecting DNA from Indigenous people, but some of the science questions around it is what happens with that DNA, for instance.
Is Canada one of the countries that is involved officially or unofficially, or having scientists involved in the collection of this?
Mm-hmm. In terms of Canada, there is a North American component of the Human Genome Diversity Project, and there is a committee that's headed by a group of scientists in Canada and USA, and there's an ethics committee that includes both Canada and USA that's headed by a professor from Stanford. And basically that committee sets out the criteria by which collection can be done in Canada. In terms of the collection in other countries, ethics committees would be formed in each of those countries based on whatever criteria their governments demand or require.
And what does Canada's demand or require?
Well, that's a really good question. The question has been a closed question. We have been trying to, along with a number of other interested parties and activists, have been trying to determine exactly where Canada does stand on this issue. There are, we know, a number of criteria that need to be developed, which, first of all, protect persons' rights in terms of ownership of their DNA, the collection of that, and the use of it. But what we do know as well is that there are very few international covenants which govern the collection, trade, and distribution, and even patenting. We know that human DNA is being patented, and that there are huge numbers of patents being sought right now by the U.S. and some other countries. And we know, for instance, that the U.S. has patented a number of indigenous people's genes, and has been challenged in terms of some of those countries where that collection has taken place in the courts, and have been challenged to, I guess, to repatriate that information back to those countries, let alone back to those people. And those are some of the issues that people are concerned about.
Among the dozens of questions that leap to my mind as you're talking are a couple of observations, one of which is, yikes, as First Nations people all around the world, I think we have been really challenged to adapt really quickly to a society that operates very differently from our own, and to also be among the poorest in terms of socioeconomics in Canada, for example. I work in an urban program in Vancouver with First Nations people whose primary sole thought is survival, you know, physical, shelter, food from one day to the next. And so that leads me to how can people begin to be involved, or how can people who may be concerned but not have a way into information become informed? And what does it mean for a government to patent DNA of Indigenous peoples? If my DNA were patented, for example, what would that mean?
Well, let me just lay some groundwork for that. I think one of the really interesting issues in this particular project is that the mandate of this project is simply to collect and put on repository and make available to database the information, in other words, and to make it available to researchers. So the patenting doesn't take place at that level. This is simply the collection agency, for instance, if you want to call it that. The patenting that can happen potentially comes at another level. When that research is made available, who is it made available to? It's made available to people in bioengineering research, biomedical research, pharmaceuticals, and military. And so in any of those areas, the researchers that have the access to this data, how are they bound to, in terms of those ethical and moral issues, let alone the legal issues around intellectual property rights, and whether or not your DNA is your intellectual property or is it your property? Those are questions that are not answered. The conventions, the international conventions, don't answer those questions adequately because it's a new area of science and technology.
We haven't caught up with their own technology.
Exactly. And the other point is that the whole area of genetic manipulation is an area that's so very new that very few people understand it. Policymakers don't understand it. In terms of what some of the implications might be in terms of genetic manipulation. What, for instance, could pharmaceuticals do with it? What, for instance, could the military do with it? What could bioengineering do in terms of medical applications? There may be some good reasons for research in that area, but at whose expense? We know, for instance, that that medicine today, it's available, but it's only available if you can afford it. It's only available if you can purchase it. We know that there are many diseases that Indigenous people are afflicted with worldwide that simple medicines are available for, but they cannot access them. They cannot access them because of economic pressures, governmental pressures, and so on, because of oppression. Now we know that if these people are the targets for collection, they are not going to be the beneficiaries. We know who the beneficiaries are going to be. It's going to be the top 5% of this country in the US and Europe, and maybe a few other countries in Asia.
In Asia,
yeah. Okay, so one of the questions that Indigenous people have to ask and have to know about is, first of all, in terms of patenting, what are their rights? But in terms of the risks also, in terms of biogenetic engineering, what potentially could happen with their genes. If someone has the key to your genes in the future, what could be done with that? We know that right now, in today's world, ethnic cleansing is a reality. We know that it's been a reality, it's been around, it's being practiced. We know that as the population grows, that some of the population pressures are going to create some very good reasons why depopulation measures should be taken. And who are going to be the targets of that? Those are questions you need to be able to look at when you have this material in terms of being put on repository and being made available to researchers and scientists and other peoples worldwide who may not be bound by ethics, may not be bound by any kinds of regulations. Now those are the really serious issues involved, besides the dollar issues that are involved.
The Nalcon Center is playing a strategic role in generating discussion, I guess, as a starting point around this. Could you explain a bit about how that comes to be? I guess for many of us, when we think of the Nalcon Center, we think of it as a center of writing.
Sure. The Nalcon Center actually is an Indian educational resource and information center. So doing all of those three things in terms of creating the possibility for Indigenous people to come there with a peer group and to be able to learn how to journal and learn how to write and access all different areas of media. To be able to do that is one area of bringing information to the people, quality information to our own people, and breaking the silence that is there for other people speaking for us. The other area is providing resources and information, being a resource and a contact center to other Indigenous organizations that are in the business of raising consciousness of non-Native people, as well as liberation in terms of Native people in oppressed areas. So we find ourselves networking and connecting with organizations that are involved in those things on an international level, mainly because North America we have access to media, we have access to voice, we have access to a number of things that may not be accessible to people in Central and South America or in Solomon Islands, for instance. Those are things that we can facilitate, and in many cases, if we join forces with other organizations like ours in North America, then we have quite a little bit more clout, I guess, than if one does it as one organization. So as a Nalcon Center, in terms of providing resources and information, we have collaborated with a number of other Indigenous organizations to try to inform and bring good information to our own people so that they are in the position of making those choices, so that they're not choiceless and they're not silenced.
The other thing that came to mind when I was reading my notes before we decided to go ahead with this program is your association and the association of your name with writing as well, because I think perhaps when I introduced you I could have elaborated a lot more, but I think as many people are aware, you are a very well-known and respected writer, not only here in Canada, but in many places. And so a connection that I see you making between that medium, I suppose, and what we're talking about is making sure that people are empowered to have a voice.
I think probably that's the purpose of my writing has been always to bring forward, in terms of the Native perspective, bring forward our thinking and our rights, and protect our rights as Native people by information, and voicing my opinion and voicing my resistance and voicing outrage when there are things that are outrageous happening. For instance, this project. We know, for instance, that right now, at this point in time, there are thousands of patents being taken, being applied for human genetic material, and that's not just Indigenous people. They're mining. It's like mine staking. They're patenting everything that they can find in hopes that it will have some purpose, pharmaceutical or medical or other purpose. Now that's called, from my point of view, that's like driftnet patenting. You just go through, and it's as though you were able to patent anything that you can see under a microscope, anything that you discover. Because patenting is supposed to have an application. If you patent something, it should be applicable for something. You don't just patent something because you can see it. Otherwise, what are discoveries about? And so, is DNA a discovery? Those are some of the questions that are being asked at these large conventions in terms of the protection of people's DNA. We know, for instance, that there was a cell line of a person in California whose cell line was patented and was used by a pharmaceutical worth billions of dollars. He tried to retrieve that cell line through the Supreme Court of U.S. and he lost the case. They said once the cell was removed from his body, it was no longer his. Now that's a U.S. Supreme Court decision. Said that maybe he could sue the doctor that gave access to the research in the pharmaceutical company, but he couldn't retrieve his cell line, and he couldn't benefit from it either, financially.
When you were mentioning earlier about the ethics committee or around the issue of ethics, something that comes up in my mind is access, and as you were telling me this story as well, are we always aware of what is being done with ourselves in terms of when we're under medical care, or?
Well, that's one of the really serious questions that we met with the ethics committee. We met with leaders of this project in California at Berkeley. Dr. Henry Greeley, from Stanford, who chairs the ethics committee, was there, and Dr. Mary Claire King from Berkeley was there. She's one of the scientists involved in the Human Genome Diversity Project. was there to talk about and answer some of the questions that we had. And there was Indigenous people from North America that were called together and organized to speak about some of these issues. One of the questions a real serious question that we had is how is informed consent made? How do you propose to give informed consent when what does informed consent constitute? When you can go anywhere in North America, and you can pick anyone from any class, middle class, high class, low class, whatever, and they won't even know what you're talking about when you're talking about DNA. I mean, there's such a small percentage of people who speak that language. It's like a secret priest language that the scientists use in terms of that science and that technology. Now, in terms of informed consent, what do? Give them a whole course in the science of DNA manipulation, and then say these are the things that are possible that can be done in terms of genetic manipulation? Do you know the things that people are doing right now in terms of transgenic manipulation? Do you know what the potential is? Do you know what they're doing with human genes right now when they're putting them into things like fish and tomatoes and cows and pigs and other things like that? Do you understand that? And in terms of your religion, your faith, do you understand the implications of that? Do you understand what it means in terms of our Indigenous spirituality and in our understanding of the natural order and our respect and our laws around that? Do you understand what that means when someone comes along and says, oh, it's just a few drops of blood we need, or a scraping from the inside of your cheek, or maybe some bone, fingernails or hair? And that's all they use. That's all they take. And how do you inform a whole community if the community leaders are told, well, maybe there's a cure here for diabetes, and you know that community has a high incidence of diabetes because of poor diet, because they've been removed from a natural diet as Indigenous people, and there's this disease, and there's a promise there. We'll set up a clinic for you in exchange for extracting DNA. So those are the kinds of pressures that are there, and in poorer countries the pressures are even much more in terms of collection of DNA and some of those promises. Some of the promises have been that there will be training done in terms of setting up of clinics, and training done in terms of collection, and a number of exchanges that have been promised in terms of exchange technology with developing countries where there are Indigenous populations. And so what are the rights of people in relation to that? What are the rights in terms of giving them information about what pharmaceuticals do, for instance? With these products that they manufacture and sell and distribute and make billions of dollars, and who does that money go to?
Money seems to be such a driving force behind a lot of this, although I suspect it's not the only driving force or the most important driving force. Something that I think is really important for people to know and maybe start thinking about is, as I have listened to you give such critical information in terms of the big important questions to ask ourselves. Mm-hmm. I haven't heard a lot of this discussion out in what you might call the political community mm-hmm. of Aboriginal people. Mm-hmm. Why am I not hearing it out there?
It's a very difficult subject to break into in terms of giving information. The difficulty in the subject is that it's so unbelievable, and it's like science fiction.
It sounds like some crazy kind of thing that we're talking about.
And then there's the oppression behind it that the science community fosters, is that you can't do anything about it anyway because you don't know anything about it. You don't have any power to be able to do anything about it, and therefore you don't have any choices. If the scientists and the governments decide to do this, they're going to do it anyway. And so those are some of the issues that we come up against in terms of trying to inform our own communities. The biggest area of concern that we have is that some of the entree into Native communities is through anthropologists, is through the medical profession, as well as through the health professions. Wherever there's a Native health clinic, for instance, those are all entrees into the Native community, as well as the dollars in terms of the tribal governments, and those people on those tribal governments not really understanding some of the really serious issues that should be asked before consenting.
Is there material that people can access, perhaps through the Nalcon Center? Or?
Definitely. We have been engaged in a campaign to inform people. We just had a large meeting that we helped organize in Phoenix, Arizona. We brought in people from Central and South America and all over North America and Canada, major Native organizations, Indigenous organizations. And we had a 5-day session in which we went through all the scientific information, and we went through all of the ethics questions, and we created a process which these organizations can network with each other in terms of disseminating that information, and also providing enough activism at the international level. So we're sending people to the various UN conventions and various other conventions where some of these decisions are being made policy-wise that countries need to adhere to. So there's that kind of activity going on, but to me the most important activity is informing the people on the home front, informing people in the community, and especially informing women, because in terms of being women and givers of life and the keepers of the generations, we do have that responsibility. So those are the people that I'm concerned about informing.
This is a huge topic to tackle, and I know we've only just barely touched the surface, and I really want to thank you, Jeanette Armstrong, for joining me on Pressure Point. My name is Valerie Dudoward.
The preceding program was produced through the facilities of Rogers Community 4, Vancouver. We want to hear from you and invite you to leave your comments and suggestions on our 24-hour response line message machine. Please call 731-5812.